When we're talking about supply, it's going to be very similar to when we looked at demand graphically and in the table for the demand schedule. When we look at supply, we're talking about individual companies producing items. So we're looking at how much companies would produce of a good at different prices, or how much, in this case, in this example, farmers would produce at different prices when we talk about coffee. We're looking at different farmers. We ask them hypothetically, how much would you grow? How many pounds of coffee beans would you produce at different prices? And in general, in economics, we have an incentive with higher prices to produce more if we're a company or a producer. So we'd expect companies would be willing to produce more on average at higher prices. All right, that's the law of supply in action. Higher prices, more production. We can see that here. First off, we have Juan, who's an individual farmer, and we're asking him how many coffee beans would you produce per year at different price levels. And what this market schedule for Juan shows us is at $5 per pound, he's willing to produce 80 pounds. If the price goes lower, let's say the price is $3 per pound in the market, he's only willing to produce 50 pounds. Law of supply and motion. Lower prices, suppliers aren't willing to produce as much. Notice if it's only $1 per pound in the marketplace, Juan's only willing to produce 10 pounds of coffee beans. Now, he's one individual producer. Just like when we looked at demand, if we look at the market, it's all the players in a particular market. So if we're looking at all the coffee producers out there, well, we have one individual one, and we have everybody else. They're all grouped together in this category. So if we asked all the other farmers to produce coffee beans, how many would you be willing to produce if the market price was $5 a pound? Well, they tell us we'd be willing to produce 7,920. Notice the price was lower, only $2 a pound. Well, collectively, they'd be willing to produce 29.70. A lower amount makes sense. Lower price they're getting for their product. They're not willing to produce as much. You can see here the total market supply, for instance, at $2 per pound. Juan's willing to produce 30 pounds of coffee beans at $2 per pound. All right, all the other producers are willing to produce 29.70. So if we take Juan's production at that price level plus everybody else's, we get 3,000 as the market supply. Now notice we don't know what the price in the market's going to be, so we're asking these suppliers, hypothetically, how much would you produce at these different price levels? The actual market price and equilibrium amount produced is going to depend on both supply and demand. Not only how much are these suppliers willing to produce at different prices, but how much are consumers willing to purchase at different prices. Now we can see, just like we had with demand, we could take the information from the supply schedule and put it on a graph. So here we have a supply curve, and notice it's upward sloping. It's showing the relationship between how much producers will produce at different prices. So on this axis, we're looking at the price of coffee, all right, from $5 down through $1. Down here, we're looking at the quantity of coffee, going anywhere from 1 to 8, and these are in thousands. And notice what these points are telling us. It's showing us how much producers are willing to produce, how many pounds of coffee beans they're willing to produce at different prices. For instance, if we look at this first point here, all right, it's showing at $1 a pound, producers are willing to produce 1,000 pounds of coffee. We get that from over here, all right, at $1 per pound. Our supply schedule shows us producers are going to produce 1,000 pounds. Notice it goes up, let's say at $4. All right, well, producers are getting more for their product. They have a higher incentive to produce, so they're willing to produce 7,000 pounds of coffee at $4 a pound. Notice that comes from the supply schedule at $4 a pound. They're willing to produce 7,000 pounds. So all the information in our supply curve comes from the numbers in our supply schedule. And again, it's upward sloping. That's very important. The reason it slopes upward is that law of supply showing producers will produce more if they get a higher price for their product in general. So this is the end result of bringing our supply and demand together in the market for coffee. Notice we're bringing both curves together here. They're intersecting at this point right here. We call that the equilibrium point. We're using the very same curves we had in the prior example. Same numbers for supply, same numbers for demand. Notice again, plotting the quantity of coffee down here on the x-axis, and you're always going to have quantity on this axis, you're always going to have price on this axis, regardless of whatever industry that we're looking at. And we're always interested in trying to figure out where these two curves intersect. And again, that supply curve, upward sloping, it's showing hypothetically how much producers, how much coffee farmers would produce at different price levels, at different possible price levels. And same deal with demand curve. It's showing hypothetically, given different prices consumers are facing, how much they'd actually purchase. And where these two meet, that's our equilibrium point. So that's what we expect the price to be in the market. That's our equilibrium price, $3. All right, we find that from the intersection. The equilibrium quantity, 5,000 pounds of coffee, that's how much coffee we expect to be sold in this particular market for the given year. All right, so the supply and demand intersection shows us what we expect to be going on in that particular market. When it gets really interesting, we'll look at changes in demand, the demand curve moving up or down, changes in supply moving up or down. And when we have demand changes or supply changes, then we're going to have equilibrium price and quantity changing. So the next step in analyzing supply and demand is trying to go through and figure out what happens when we actually have changes in demand or supply for a particular part of the economy.